Our next panel on Canada will be moderated by Senator Doug Black. Doug is a member of the Canadian Senate based in Calgary. He's senior counsel for Dentons in our Canada region. He's Queen's Counsel. Recently, he was named one of the 25 most influential lawyers in Canada, and he is a great guy and a great energy lawyer, as you will hear in a moment. Doug?
Thank you very much. Well, good morning to you all, and I have to say I love Clint's introductions. Clint, maybe we can hear that one again, can we? As an elected politician and a very proud member of the Senate of Canada, you don't often get introductions like that, so I appreciate that. Well, it's great to be back at this session. We have a great audience. Thank you all for being here. We have great participants. Thanks for all those who participated to date. And I'm hopeful that the panel that you're next going to hear from will meet the very high standard that's been set already this morning. As Clint's indicated, my name is Doug Black. I am a lawyer. I'm a member of the Canadian Senate. I sit on the Energy Committee of the Canadian Senate. And I've also been involved in partnership with the Economic Club of Canada over the last number of months in doing a tour of the major cities of Canada, speaking about the importance of market access, Aboriginal engagement, innovation, and other issues. So energy is number one on my agenda. We have an outstanding panel this morning, and I hope you will agree with me after you've heard their presentations. We've Edward Greenspon, Brian Lee Crowley, and Ambassador Gordon Giffin. Ever so quickly, Ed is the managing editor, Energy, Environment, and Commodities for Bloomberg. It's an international portfolio, but he sits in Toronto. Brian Lee Crowley, who I've done a fair bit of work with over the last year, is the managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. This is one of Canada's preeminent think tanks, and clearly Canada's preeminent think tank on national issues. He is also a very highly respected author and commentator. Gordon Giffin was America's 19th ambassador to Canada, and I can tell you we still miss him. He is clearly a legal and business cross-border superstar. He is extraordinarily involved in the law on a cross-border basis, as well as business, sitting on a number of Canada's major corporate boards. Quickly, and ever so quickly, since I spoke here last year, a number of things have happened in Canada, principally in Canada, but also vis-a-vis the Canadian-US relationship. The summary is that we're not making progress. We're not getting the job done. There are some bright lights. LNG in British Columbia appears to be on the verge of moving ahead. But with the fall in the price of oil that we've heard about, with the change of government in Alberta, where we have gone from a conservative government to a left-wing government, and that's no judgment, it just is a fact. We've seen an increase in taxes. We have seen the announcement that there's going to be a royalty review. There's a level of uncertainty been injected into Alberta, which is the home of the energy industry in Canada, which has caused investment to, at a minimum, slow down. We have made no substantial progress on market access and pipelines. The General spoke openly in respect of Keystone this morning. There is nothing that I can add to his comments. But we have made no progress on domestic pipelines as well, for a number of reasons that you may very well hear about. The Supreme Court of Canada has rendered a decision this year giving enhanced power to First Nations in Canada around negotiations respecting energy projects and any other projects that might be on their lands or lands they may have occupied in one form or another over the last number of generations. What we do have last week is the premiers of Canada, the equivalent of your state governors, have agreed upon a national energy strategy. I'm happy with that. There's, of course, the devil is in the details, but it's a very progressive start. 5 or 6 years ago, I founded the Energy Policy Institute of Canada, whose sole mandate was to develop an energy strategy or an energy framework for Canada. So I'm very pleased with last week's development. It is a start, it's unification, and it is, we're on the right road. More to be done. I want to hear more during the day about the possibility of moving that to a continental energy strategy, again, as the General referred to this morning. That's where we are. It's not particularly a positive story at this moment in time. Tremendous work to be done, but the work will get done. Let's kick off the panel. Let's start with my friend, Ed.
Thank you, Doug. I think my job is to provide a bit of an overview of the oil sands experience and in the context of two shocks that have reverberated through Canada and the world. In the case of one of them over the last 9 months, and that's an economic shock and a political shock. I just do want to take half a second, though, to say it's great to be on a panel with Doug is Canada's only, I think, elected senator, which is maybe anomalous to some of you that we have unelected senators, but that's the way the country works. Brian is my former classmate. Well, he wasn't actually my classmate because he was more advanced than I am and remains so at London School of Economics. And Gordon, in addition to being the 19th ambassador to Canada, is the best ambassador Canada's ever had. Mostly a product of his hockey knowledge, but nonetheless good at other things as well. And I'm a journalist, which is a rare species to have in the room, and I'm going to try my best not to be too alarmist and not too sensational. I have a positive view of this, and that the cup is only 3/4 empty, so I think that's a place where I'll start. So let me start with the economic shock. Obviously, Dan Jurgen talks about a great sweating, and the Saudis are sweating out the high-cost producers, and they aimed at shale, and shale ducked, and the oil sands got it right in the gut. And that's one of the major problems, obviously, we're dealing with in Canada. And why is the oil sands so vulnerable? Why are the oil sands so vulnerable? They're high-cost producers with a lot of upfront capital, a lot of capex required in there. They're high-carbon producers, both in real terms, but even more so in apparent terms, if you will, in terms of reputational terms. They have low market access, and in the United States, you're most familiar with the Keystone pipeline saga, but there's 4 projects that are meant to break the logjam of Canada's, 3 other projects meant to break the logjam of Canada's heavy dependence on the United States market, over-dependence on the United States market for 99% of our oil exports. And all 4 of these projects, Keystone and the other 3, are stalled or dead. One's definitely dead, the gateway to northern British Columbia. Trans Mountain, which is really just mostly a twinning until it hits the outskirts of Vancouver, where development requires it to take a different path. You would think that would be an easy one for Richard Kinder, but it's not. And the Energy East pipeline, which I'll mention a little bit more in a second, which is an amazingly innovative way to go through 6 provinces, end up in New Brunswick at the Irving refinery, and hit markets in Europe and India and the Gulf Coast without having to go through the United States and getting a presidential permit, is also running into political trouble. So low market access a problem, and then finally the 4th issue was low public trust, which obviously flows from the other ones. The oil and gas industry in Canada, my friends at Ipsos, the polling firm, had showed me some research that they did last year recently, and it shows 44 countries trust in the oil and gas sector, and the trust factor, Canada's kind of clustered with some other developed countries in low trust, but somewhat uniquely on the other axis, on the y-axis, it's sitting up well above the other countries on the reason for the trust, and the reason for the trust is a belief that they're low CSR, bad corporate citizenship, if you will. So there's a lack of trust in terms of the companies and their public roles. So here's what points 2, 3, and 4 I think tell you. the carbon issue, the market access, and the low public trust is that Canada now comes with political risk. What we sell ourselves for is that we don't have political risk. But if you can't be relied upon to build infrastructure to get the product to market, and I think this is becoming a big issue in Asia, as confidence in Canada's ability to deliver, then we have some political risk. Not the risk of expropriation, obviously, but the risk of not being able to move assets. I'm going to stay away from the expression stranded assets because it's so loaded. And this is an internal Canadian problem. I think Brian will talk a little bit about it vis-a-vis Aboriginals, environmentalists for sure. But it's a broader problem as the population becomes more carbon concerned, and the oil sands have such a poor reputation. Particularly youth, soccer moms who are worried about their kids. Public opinion on climate change throughout the world is in motion. It's in an accelerated motion. The oil companies in Europe are seeing this and trying to catch up with it as they approach the Paris summit. In North America, we're a little slower on it, but this is a bizarre comparison in some ways, but I think it's quite valid. It's a little bit like the same-sex marriage issue in that, the issue doesn't seem to really be grabbing and salient politically for a long time, and then it tips and it accelerates, and driven, I think, by people's kids. I gave a speech in Calgary recently, the Pipeline Association, and I said, these people, it's not they, the environmentalists, it's your own kids in your own house, and there are a lot of 30-somethings in the crowd, and they were all nodding. So I think that's something we have to keep in mind. Okay, there's a couple positives here, too. Positives are that, innovation has the potential to bring the cost down, and the intensity is a bit of a mug's game in some way, but to bring carbon emissions down as well. And there's been a lot of innovation, so that's good. The desire for diversification of supply is good for Canada. And I think most importantly, the great thing the oil sands have for it is that oil companies spend billions and billions. I think Shell spends $35 billion a year, Exxon about $50 billion a year, just trying to use that capital to replace their reserves. Not even growth capital, just kind of trying to hold where you are capital and not succeeding very well at that. If you're in the oil sands, you don't have to worry about replacement oil. You got your replacement oil, essentially. So that's, I think that's an important point. Okay, let me talk for a couple minutes about the political shock as well. So as you probably all know, in Alberta, there was a provincial election, Doug's home province, and the New Democratic Party, which is, I don't know, a little bit to the left of the Labour Party in England, let's say, won the election in Alberta. In Alberta's case, it's probably quite a bit to the left of the Labour Party in England because it's never had the opportunity to govern. So Premier Notley has, a lot of people. Now this kind of Alberta's political culture. This is Bernie Sanders winning in Texas. Okay, that's what happened. It was a shocking result. Shocking result. But not really when you look at it, because the Conservatives had run out of steam, and it was very much a time for change, protest vote. Alberta is very every 40 years, whether they need it or not, they change governments in a rather shocking manner. So the change mood was super strong. As Doug mentioned, for the industry, there's issues now because the Premier has promised a royalty review and has set up a mechanism for royalty review. She's talked about raising corporate taxes. She's talked about raising the minimum wage. And she's already introduced some changes into the carbon regime that double the price of carbon $15 to $30 and change the tripping mechanism, if you will. So what does one do? I guess, one can try to outweight the NDP. Certainly there's not going to be a lot of new investment going into Alberta for the next little while in any case. And, it's not a bad strategy. In Canada, 5 provinces have previously elected NDP governments, and in 3 of those provinces, they've lasted 1 term. Only in 2 of the provinces did they manage to win a 2nd term. But it seems to me the much better strategy is to leverage Premier Notley's strengths, which is credibility with the people with whom consensus has to be worked out. And she has the credibility to do this, and she's also, I think, shown already a propensity to understand the economic driver that oil is in the province. Now I'm getting the wrap up, so I'm going to take 30 seconds more just to say, because I was asked to just talk about there's a federal election in Canada on October 19th. Three parties are competitive. We've never sort of seen a situation like this. They're basically tied, but the NDP is in the lead in that tie. I think the most important things to understand there, and the NDP is jammed up on energy policy, I might say, because they only are supportive of one pipeline in Canada, the Energy East pipeline. It's becoming very unpopular in Quebec, which has now become the NDP's base in the country. Then again, if you're running for prime minister, you can't be against all pipelines, so what do? You attack the process, and they're already have begun attacking the process. The Conservatives are the pro-energy party, clearly, but they've been unable to execute on policy in any successful way. The Liberals are kind of halfway between the two. The most important thing, I guess, as I say, to remember is that there's a very strong change mood in Canada as well, and anybody can win this election, but one of the things that will happen is whether the NDP or the Liberals emerge as the alternative during the campaign to the Harper government. And I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Ed. Brian, please.
Thanks, Doug. Well, I think my comments fit very nicely with what Eddie's just said. Traditionally, I think people in the oil and gas industry in particular have thought of Canada as a place of low political risk, and one of the main reasons for that, I think Eddie's quite correct about this. One of the main reasons for that is we knew what the decision-making process was, and we knew who was in charge. We knew who we needed to deal with in order to get energy projects approved, and we knew what the process was. We knew what the rules were. All of that's up the spout. All that's up the spout. Okay, and I'm going to talk about two things in particular that have driven that ejection up the spout. Before I do so, I'll just mention that the two things I'm going to talk about are the position of Aboriginal people in Canada, huge changes. The second is what we call in Canada the social license movement, a term you may be familiar with, but we have come to give it two competing and incompatible meanings in Canada, which I'll dig into in a second. But just before I do, just to give a little more context around what Eddie was saying, one of the reasons that all of this is so terribly important, particularly our ability to build pipelines, is that, and I don't know whether you know this or not, but the oil sands is now unofficially, hasn't been recognized yet by the people who keep the tally, but the oil sands is now the largest single deposit of oil in the world. There's about 850 billion barrels of oil in the oil sands. That's recoverable oil in the oil sands. And so this is a geopolitical strategic fact of enormous significance. But of course, you know, before we developed in Canada the technology to be able to extract the oil from the oil sands, it wasn't a source of oil, it was a geological oddity. It was kind of a cosmic joke. It was God's largest oil spill, but we couldn't do anything with it, right? As a result of the technology we've created, it's become recoverable, but it may be that we make it unrecoverable not because of the lack of technology, but because of the inability of us to create the political circumstances in which we can extract it. So that's the problem that we face. So I mentioned that there are two things that have particularly made difficult Canada's reputation as a place where you knew who to deal with and knew what the rules were in order to make investments both in extracting natural resources and getting them to market. Let's start with Aboriginal people. Many of you will know that the position of Aboriginal people in Canada is and has traditionally been for well over a century, has been completely shocking. Aboriginal people live on reserves, live by and large in conditions of appalling poverty, poor water access, poor sanitation, poor education, everything you can name. But interestingly, what's happening now is that for the very first time, it used to be that Aboriginal people lived in the back of beyond, away from urban areas and so on, no economic opportunities, and that was part of the puzzle that we had in trying to improve the position of Aboriginal people. Now Aboriginal people, in many instances, live on the doorstep of fantastic natural resource wealth. And so this is an opportunity for Aboriginal people which has not existed really before, certainly in my lifetime. So Aboriginal people who want to change those circumstances that I've described have a huge interest in wanting to participate in the natural resource economy. Put that together with the fact that as a result of a 40-year campaign of political, constitutional, and judicial activism, Aboriginal people have won fantastic influence over decision-making around natural resource development. Eddie made some reference to it. I'll just mention one thing, which is that the Supreme Court of Canada has determined, to use their phrase, that the Crown, that is to say government in Canada, the Crown has a duty to consult and accommodate Aboriginal interests where those interests are affected by decisions that governments have to take, including giving permission for development of natural resource activities. So our own analysis at the Institute is that a duty to consult and accommodate is not a veto, however much Aboriginal people might like to imply that that's what it is. It is what it says. It is governments have a duty to consult and accommodate. It's not a legal obligation on companies, but basically everybody assumes that companies pretty much have the same sort of obligation to consult and accommodate. What that means in effect is that successful projects now are the ones that sit down with Aboriginal people at the very beginning and say, okay, look, we'd like to develop this natural resource opportunity. How can we do that together with you? One of the big obstacles that we face in unlocking natural resource wealth in Canada now is that the natural resource industry is by and large run by engineers, and that's a huge problem. And I'll tell you why it's a huge problem, because engineers tend to say, okay, what have we got? We've got this oil deposit here. Where do we want to get it? We want to get it here. So give me a ruler, draw a line on the map, and they say, okay, that's what our project needs to look like. And then they go to Aboriginal people and say, here's my line, how much? It's a loser. It's a loser. What you need to do is you need to say, here's what I've got. How can we work together to get it from there to here? See? It's a real simple human relations problem that the industry has not come to terms with. Now, Aboriginal people understand that even though they don't have a veto, they have tremendous bargaining power now, tremendous bargaining power. And that bargaining power is doubled by the other phenomenon that I mentioned, which has made it difficult to know who's in charge, who's got decision-making power, and so on. And that's the growth of this social license movement, which I referred to. And what I mean when I say social license, it may be a term that many of you are familiar with in the corporate world. Mostly people in the business world, when they talk about social license, say, well, we need a social license to operate. What they mean is we've got to have sort of rational reputation management. You know, no company wants to be in a community that doesn't want them. You want people to think well of you, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so nobody's got a problem with that kind of social license. But the problem is that in Canada, the environmental movement has seized on this concept of social license and said, hey, what a great idea. If we grab the social license concept and say, you can't operate if you don't have social license, and by the way, we are the ones who determine whether you've got it or not, and the standard is whether or not we hold up a hand-lettered sign on the 6 o'clock evening news saying, you know, Company X has no social license, we get to determine whether you get permission to proceed or not. And so social license has become the battle cry of many people in the environmental movement. And what we're discovering more and more, in my view, is that there is an incredible intersection between the power that Aboriginal people have acquired and the social license movement, in the sense that Aboriginal people now have acquired the pole position, if I can call it that way. If Aboriginal people and the environmental social license movement collaborate together against a project, it's dead. It's dead. The political authorities will not, in my experience, move to approve such a project. On the other hand, when you can win over the support of Aboriginal people who have tremendous, unlike the oil and gas industry, have tremendous credibility in the eyes of Canadians, especially on environmental issues. If you can win Aboriginal people over, that's enough to tip the balance in favor of political authorities being able to approve projects. So that's the strategic calculation now. There are lots of things that show that we can make those deals with Aboriginal people. In fact, contrary to what you read in the newspapers, deals are the rule rather than the exception now. But it's the exceptions, those big ones where, you know, one Aboriginal group turns down, according to the headlines, $1 billion in order to approve a pipeline. People say, oh my God, they're turning down $1 billion. We can't get anything done. That's the exception. We can perhaps talk about what that really meant. But the rule is that there are hundreds of these deals being done around the country every year between Aboriginal people and natural resource companies, and we can unlock more of that opportunity by understanding Aboriginal people and the legal position they've acquired, and remove a lot of these obstacles to natural resource development. Sorry, Gordon, I took a minute or two of yours there.
Thank you very much. Tremendous, Brian. Ambassador, take us home.
Thanks, Doug. First, I want to thank Clint for inviting me to participate. I'm a 22-day newly minted partner at Dentons US, and enormously proud and exhilarated to be part of the family. So to one of the leading, if not the leading energy lawyers in the United States, thank you. Great program that you put together. And also great to be here with Doug and Eddie and Brian. I do want to point out that I get 10 minutes American, which is 15 minutes Canadian. So take that into account when you're holding up the cards. Before becoming the 19th U.S. Ambassador to Canada, I was actually, for all of my legal career, an energy regulatory lawyer, and in fact used to handle presidential permits back in the 20th century when they were considered on the merits. It was a much simpler process to deal with back then. I'm an optimist by nature, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the Canada-US energy context. There is no doubt in my mind, and I know we've got lots of attendees here from outside North America, and I don't mean to be the typical U.S. perspective on the world, but I actually believe North America can be an economic juggernaut in the world if we figure out how to collaborate and harmonize on energy policy in this continent. And because of the fact that clearly over the last decade or so, energy policy and environmental policy have in effect merged and have to be considered at least in parallel, if not where that they actually intersect now. We've got to think of energy in the context of environmental policy. Now, those of us in the United States like to look at Canada and say you're insensitive to environmental policy, you're not doing your job, therefore we have to do things down here like at least slow walk pipelines until you get your policies straight north of the border. Well, that's sort of a glass house attitude as far as I'm concerned. When you look at Canada, and you can debate one policy or another, but you've got a carbon tax in British Columbia, you've got an energy levy, it's not really or a carbon levy in Alberta, which has, as Eddie indicated, has just been increased. You've got Ontario and Quebec participating in the cap and trade system with not exactly the world's leading denier of climate change, California, and you've got a federal government in Canada who has implemented by federal policy the phasing out of coal-fired power generation across the country. I think Canada may have 20 coal-fired power plants today. There's probably 250 of them in the Midwest of the United States. So we look at Canada and say, you know, we'll only deal with you when you get your carbon policy progressive. I'd suggest that possibly they're ahead of us in some respects. But what's going on in Canada in many respects is that the provinces are running away with the policy. And this is not by any means a criticism of the federal government. It's sort of a component of the Canadian system right now, where the provinces sort of exert themselves and then look to Ottawa for the money. But what we need is a comprehensive federal conversation about what we're doing together on this continent that will, not only for the economics of it, which are compelling, but for the security of North America, not just energy security, but just geopolitical security of North America. Now, the oxygen gets sucked out of that conversation by 3 letters, KXL. And I believe on the merits, if we ever get to those, KXL demonstrates that it's in the interests of the United States of America to have that pipeline completed. And that's what our test is. It's unfortunately under the law, it's not how good of friends Canada is and whether you're nice people and play hockey well and send the polar vortex south. It's whether or not it's in the demonstrable interests of the United States of America. I think it is. But a consequence of that whole debate is that we don't talk about anything else in the Canada-US energy context, and we've got to stop that. We've got to broaden the conversation. Even as we sit on this panel, we haven't heard a lot about the fact that Canada is and can be an enormous supplier of clean, renewable hydropower to the United States. Hydro-Quebec today, Manitoba Hydro are huge suppliers of clean energy to the United States. Now, our policies make it tough. We should fix that. When you look at the fact that I think in Ontario they're talking about contracting with Labrador, Newfoundland and Labrador, to get power from the Muskrat Falls project. You know how they're going to get it there? They're going to take it underwater through the Maritimes to New England, through New England over to Ontario, because of the complications with policy in Canada to transmit power across Quebec. So, and Manitoba is now delivering significant clean renewable power to Wisconsin and Minnesota. It's a great idea. Think about the avoided construction of power projects, generation projects in the northern part of the United States, which typically would be fossil fuel based, if we can figure out how to collaborate with Canada on clean power. We actually send power during the winter north. We send natural gas. We, United States, send natural gas north during the winter as well. So this isn't a one-way conversation if we get adult about having it. Natural gas flows both ways, as I suggested, not as much south as used to be, simply because of the volumes that we're producing in the United States today. We get uranium from Canada. Cameco, based in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, is one of the larger, and they've got facilities in the United States as well, but they're one of the largest uranium providers to the United States, and we have, as everybody knows, nuclear power in the United States. So when we talk about the opportunities for collaborating on LNG, where the facilities are, where the gas comes from, are enormous for North America. So what does that say? We need to get over in the United States this idea that somehow we're superior on environmental policy. We're not. We're just not. We may be equal, but we're not superior. And at the highest levels of our government recognize it's in our interests, together economically to have a very serious conversation about policy, to recognize that if you want to look at carbon intensity, I don't know how all of you all got here today. Many of you, I guess, walked from the hotel, but some of you drove your car. That's actually, it's not coming from power plants. It's not coming from oil sands production. It's coming from those of us who use the product. And we just need to have a rational conversation about how to deal with that in a North American context. I will wrap up, even though you're not giving me my extra 5 minutes under the Canadian rule. I believe that the rising credibility of a guy by the name of Ernie Moniz in this town is critical to this conversation, because I think he believes that the North American energy dialogue, and of course North America does include Mexico, so they'd have to be also included in the conversation. But I think for a variety of reasons, one is the work on the Iran deal. Secretary Moniz has a lot more throw weight in Washington today, and I think he firmly believes in the idea of a Canada, well, a North American energy dialogue that would produce harmonized, consensus, coherent policy that permits rational development of both the resources and the infrastructure, pipelines, transmission lines, and so forth, let alone railroad tracks, in order to realize what is there for us to convert on, and that's an economic opportunity for our countries. I'll shut up.
Well, thank you very, very much, Ambassador. We can hope that as this dialogue continues, right, as this dialogue continues over the next number of years, that we are going to get to the position of launching. Don't know how it's going to happen, don't know who's going to take the leadership. Maybe it's people in this room, maybe it's people on this panel, but a continental energy framework or strategy is critical for both the US and for Canada. And as people prepare for questions, and I'm looking forward to that, I just need to say as a Canadian senator that because you're our great friends, we've aired a lot of dirty linen today about the problems in Canada. But you need to know that Canada is a great place for business, and anyone who's thinking about doing business in Canada, you need to get right on up there right away. And we will try and help you be successful. Questions, please, for our outstanding panel. Please.
I'm very pro-Canada. I'm a McGill graduate, but I have a challenge for you, which is part of the problem with importing energy from Canada is that it is government subsidized. And so you have this complete policy disconnect in the US where the markets it's being imported to, for the most part, are competitive, and American companies are putting their capital at risk. And then you have the Canadian government subsidizing large resources and bringing them in and making the American investments uneconomic. So I throw that out and interested in your response and how you coordinate the two.
Well, you seem to be looking at me, so I'll start. Well, I sit on the board of two publicly traded energy companies in Canada, and I've missed the subsidy. I better go back and make sure we're getting our fair share of it, because
I don't think there are subsidies.
I haven't. Well, yeah. Well, that's water, right? So I don't actually see the subsidies, but I will point out to you that if you look at our tax laws, there are an enormous number of tax subsidies for the production of certain energies in the United States. So, but to the degree there are any things that are dislocating the economics, they ought to be part of the conversation. I actually, don't believe that there's much in the way of a distortion of economics. But if the Canadians want to sell to the state of New York discounted power, I'd say take every last kilowatt we can get, because the economic development implications of that would be significant. I'm rather familiar, though, with the deals over the years. Vermont, for years, has been getting a substantial amount of their power from Hydro-Quebec. They do a commercial deal. They don't give it away. Now, what the economics are on the Canadian side, it doesn't matter, but it's a competitive rate on our side of the border. So I actually don't think there are those economic dislocations. But if there are, to the degree there are, that's part of the conversation.
Well, we don't have a lot of time, and I don't know. I could add a little bit, but I'd rather get to more questions.
Yeah, you betcha. Bottom line is, we're just not aware of subsidies from Canada, and if there are, we need to find out.
Yeah.
Perhaps we could put them to use.
It certainly isn't applied to oil and gas. You know, the one example you've mentioned, which I agree with, Hydro-Quebec, I don't think we should talk about it as if it's energy from Canada. It is one source from one province, one kind of energy.
Other questions? You bet.
Yes, I've been involved with pipeline risk assessment for over 20 years, and I've had the privilege of working on KXL, Energy East, and several other projects. I find that if you talk to the people in the communities, I've done over 300 open houses with people, and I find that people are largely open to these projects. I think we have a disconnect a lot in the media with the coming back to social licensing. I think if we did have a national policy that came, both actually a North American policy that brought together these ideas, I think the public is actually very open to these projects. I think it's communicating it efficiently, and I guess I'd throw that back to you and ask for your comments.
Gentlemen?
That the public is very open to the projects. You know, we sort of seen polling out over and over on Keystone in the United States that the supportive faction is much larger than the non-supportive faction. But I think the intensity of the highly opposed is much greater than the intensity and numbers of the highly in favor. And you know, if you look at Keystone, which got stopped in Nebraska, you know, when I think it was about to be approved probably in late 2011, early 2012, it was kind of cruising towards its final approval. Yeah, it was a very small number of people who were able to stop it, but quite frankly, the advocates of it were nowhere on the ground, were not engaged in the process. We mugged ourselves in many ways. TransCanada knew that it had a problem in Nebraska. It chose not to spend what people tell me is $100 million to reroute it, and it got stopped by a pro-pipeline Republican governor, essentially, that gave Obama his, you know, his exit ramp. So I don't think, you know, big polling numbers or support are really the salient issue. I just add one more thing. You know, we did a story recently, and you know, one of the executives of one of the large pipeline companies said, every time we go into a community, the environmentalists are already there. And I thought, that's not something you're supposed to lament, that's something you're supposed to fix.
Could I just very quickly, if I could talk not about the American public, but the Canadian public, a very practical example. In the last provincial election in British Columbia, you know, Eddie says that the pipeline from the oil sands to the west coast, or both pipelines, are dead or dying. I think you need to look at what happened in the last provincial election in British Columbia. There you had an outgoing government that was terrifically unpopular, was cruising to defeat. The opposition party started out the election saying, well, we're not going to approve the Gateway pipeline, but we might, you know, we're open on others. And then in the middle of the campaign, the party that was set to win the election said, we're against all pipelines, and they went down to a crashing defeat. When you actually asked the question, you got a very loud answer from the population that said, we need opportunity, we need development, we need it done reasonably, we need it done to high environmental standards, but we are not anti-development. And that was in British Columbia, which is supposed to be the province most recalcitrant to this kind of development. So I'm not at all pessimistic, but you have to present it in the right way, in the right circumstances, to the right audience.
Well put, well put. I can't read that. I think
It
that
says
might
wrap
say
up.
wrap up. Okay.
That's an
I think we
American
need to
term.
wrap up. Thank you all for your attention. We appreciated it.
Before you leave the dais, let me just say this was the strongest panel we've ever had on Canada, which is a very high bar because for the past 4 years, they've all been sensational, but you really did a beautiful job. Moderator Doug, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.